All right, so we are going to be recording this, just so you know. So for those that cannot attend, with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So hello, everybody. My name is Matt Hardy. I'm the Program Director for Planning and Performance Management here at AASHTO. I'd like to extend a warm welcome on behalf of AASHTO and the TPM Pooled Fund lead, Christos Xenophontos from the Rhode Island DOT. Christos is on vacation and could not be here today. And as I said, we had about 200 people registered for today on this sort of midsummer day. It's hot here in the DC area, so glad that everybody could join us. The TPM Pooled Fund, the Transportation Performance Management Pooled Fund, sponsored by AASHTO in cooperation with FHWA, is very pleased to sponsor this Transportation Performance Management webinar series. Today is our 13th bi-monthly TPM webinar series sponsored by the TPM Pooled Fund, again with support from the AASHTO Committee on Performance-Based Management and the Federal Highway Administration. Sharing knowledge and building capacity are critical aspects of the TPM Pooled Fund. The purpose of the webinar series is to support the broader TPM community by sharing lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge with the transportation performance management community. So just as a reminder, the TPM Pooled Fund is transitioning to an AASHTO technical service program at the end of this calendar year. So we invite all the state DOT to encourage your agencies to sign up for the AASHTO TSP. At this point, all of the state DOT should have received an email from AASHTO with the current offering of technical service programs. And it's important to note that those state DOTs that are participating or getting access to the CAT lab, the University of Maryland CAT lab for the PM3 web-based tools, that if you want to get continued access, we need to talk because that access basically ends at the end of this calendar year through the existing TPM Pooled Fund, and we have to establish a new agreement through the AASHTO technical service program. But anyways, please contact me if you have any questions about that and you're from one of the state DOTs. Today's topic, which is very timely, I'm not sure why, is greenhouse gas reductions and environmental measures. This interactive webinar will look at several perspectives and recently completed research on this topic. Specifically, our webinar today will highlight some of the important work that has been going on around the country to develop environmental policies, legislation, regional and agency goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Before I review the agenda, just a few sort of basic brief logistics. First, for more information on this webinar series, and if you want to get a recording of this, if you want to access the slides that people are using, please go to the TPM portal. That's at tpm-portal.com. Click on TPM webinar series under events in the main menu, and hopefully Lori could put that link in the chat so everybody has it. So today, now for the agenda for today. So first up, I'll provide some information about the recently published federal notice on the greenhouse gas emissions federal performance measure. At this point, the US DOT folks really can't say much about it. So we didn't want to put them on the spot or anything like that. So I'm going to try to provide some basic information, just sort of facts about it. That's my intent. I'm not going to try to have any sort of opinions or anything like that. Just provide a basic understanding of what's there, and then some tools and some resources that if you want to go look more into it, you can. Next up will be Deanna Belden and Chris Behrens from the Minnesota Department of Transportation, and they will talk about the history of their state's legislation around GHG reductions, how they are addressing GHG by giving the traveling public options to reduce VMT, and how MnDOT is working with its partners to establish GHG reduction strategies. After that, Teresa Takushi from the Colorado Department of Transportation will cover a new rule in Colorado aimed at pollution and GHG reductions, the resulting state DOT policy directive, and how their state's transportation partners are working together to implement the associated requirements. After that, Ting Ma from the District of Columbia Department of Transportation will talk about GHG tracking, target setting, and reduction efforts that have been initiated across several sectors, and DDOT's transportation-specific strategies. And then finally, rounding out the presentations, Gary McVoy from McVoy Associates will cover the recently published web-based guidebook for NCHRP 25 56, better known as Methods for State DOTs to Reduce Greenhouse Gas Emissions from the Transportation Sector. And we'll have time for Q&A after our presentation. So please enter any questions that you may have in the chat. That'll be the best way to do that. So let's start the program. With that, what I want to cover are some basics about the FHWA GHG Greenhouse Gas Emissions NPRM and give you a few resources. Next slide, please. So these are two screenshots of the actual Federal Register notice. It was published last Friday, July 15th. It has a 90-day comment period, meaning the docket closes on October 13th of 2022. And anybody and everybody, agencies, individual people, companies, they're all encouraged to submit comments on the proposal within that, the updated regulation text that is proposed in the NPRM. The way it's structured is the first 2/3 of the notice is really sort of justification and more background on the proposed changes. And the last third are the actual proposed changes. So that's what I'm showing on the right side of the screen. These are the proposed changes. And I think what's really important to point out are the first red box, which is the metric, and then the second red box, which is the actual performance measure. So the metric is similar to what was proposed in 2017, and it's the tailpipe CO2 emissions on the NHS for any particular calendar year. And the measure, what a state DOT or an MPO will have to set a target on, is that percent reduction for a year based upon a reference year. So those are the two important equations, I would argue, within the regulation. Go to the next slide, please. And I'll show you where you can get links to that, direct links, in a minute. So the basic information, so who is going to be responsible for this? It's both state DOTs and metropolitan planning organizations. As I said, the what are tailpipe CO2 carbon dioxide emissions limited to the NHS or the National Highway System. And really it's how it's being calculated is a function, the metric, a function of gallons of fuel sold, and there are several different varieties of fuel sold, times a CO2 factor for that type of fuel, add all that up, and then multiply it by the ratio of the NHS, the National Highway System VMT, divided by total VMT. That's what all the state DOTs are going to have to use to sort of calculate and develop their measure and establish their target on. MPOs have the option of developing a different type of metric that might be better or different or easier, or I'm not sure what the correct verb or adjective is, for their region. So they won't have to use that metric of gallons of fuel sold, CO2 factor times the that ratio of NHS VMT to total VMT. It will be limited to the NHS, but they can propose alternative means to get to that. Within the NPRM, it's proposed that states and MPOs would have to set their targets beginning October 1st of 2022. And if you do the calculation, comments are due October 13th, but it's proposed that states and MPOs would have to set their targets and kind of report on stuff beginning October 1st. So there's a conflict there, and they actually talk about that within the NPRM and how should this be rolled out. What is that time frame? How are they going to measure this, or like what's the goal? Maybe is to establish declining targets. So you have to establish declining targets to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So they have a definition of net zero emissions by 2050 within the actual regulation. They also talk about an interim or maybe a medium-term target of basically a 50% reduction of 2005 CO2 levels by 2030. And they do want to use the existing national performance management framework. So all the states, many MPOs have been using this over the past 4 or 5 years. They don't want to recreate a new framework or anything. They want to use the existing framework. And then the why is transportation. The transportation sector is a large producer of the greenhouse gas emission. So just trying to point out some of the facts that I know of within the NPRM. If you go to the next slide, please. We have a number of tools and resources. I'm not going to get into sort of what AASHTO is doing in any great detail. We do have a commenting schedule. You can find that if you're from a state DOT on the TPM portal website. So we have lots of resources available. If you go to www.tpm-portal.com/GHG-NPRM, we have information there. It's publicly available. So if you're from a state, a city, an MPO, you can access all of it. So we're not, trying to limit it to the state DOTs or anything like that. There, for the AASHTO members, we do have a commenting template. So if you want to provide us with comments, we have a timeline that we are using sort of internally to try to collect comments from our members. And we also have what I do want to point out is an analysis tool that anybody can use to better understand how they can affect the proposed metric within the NPRM. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. Next slide, please. So this is just a screenshot of the website. So you can kind of see the documents, the tools, and everything there. The middle one, the document, has, if you download that Word file, there are specific links to the NPRM and to other supporting documents just that I think anybody who's interested in this NPRM would want to get access to. You can download the tool. It's an Excel-based tool. You can click on that. And then also I did a presentation similar to this, a little more in-depth last Thursday. You can download that. That has a little bit more sort of opinion, Matt Hardy opinion in there. So I didn't want to talk about that today. Just want to keep this as above board as possible. So that's available to anybody. If you go to the next slide, please. The GHG tool that we have, again, it's an Excel-based tool. And basically what it provides, so there's some assumptions in there and relationships in terms of if you look at the main value that a state DOT within the metric could affect is gallons of fuel sold. So we're trying to build in or create a tool that a state DOT or an MPO or a city could use to try to say, what can we do to reduce gallons of fuel sold? So there could be more EVs, there could be more hybrid electric vehicles, there could be more work from home, increased transit, bike lanes, all that sort of stuff. So the tool allows you to sort of model that and better understand what would happen to your emissions. And that's what I'm showing here is kind of the output, is that you have a baseline condition, a future that is, if we didn't do anything, and then sort of this test or this scenario that if we were able to do something, what would happen? In this case, I think this is for like Arkansas, if they were able to increase their the percent of EVs in their fleet from 1% to 15%, this is the reduction that they could see in terms of CO2 emissions, both generally and then just on the NHS. Don't have time to get into the details today. You can download the tool. We have some more documentation associated with it, so please take a look at it. And I think my final slide, if you go to the last one, a number of states, 11 to be exact, did submit a comment letter back on July 18th to the administrator, sort of supporting the intent of the rule. So just want to say that there are states out there. So there are comments coming into the docket already. So this is sort of public information. So there's it'll be an interesting process that we go through and to see what the comments are. But there are a number of states already that are supportive of it, and in fact, many of the states are here today to sort of talk about what they're doing. So I'm excited to kind of hear what they have to say. So with that, that's all I wanted to talk about. Again, if you have specific questions, please post them in the chat, and then I can answer them as needed. But with that, because I'm probably a little bit late, I am going to introduce Deanna Belden. and Chris Behrens, and they're going to sort of kick us off initially with one of those state DOT presentations. I'm just going to read my notes here. Deanna Beld and Chris Behrens lead the Performance Risk and Investment Analysis Unit at Minnesota DOT, where their group is responsible for the agency's investment analysis, online performance dashboard, federal TPM measure reporting, and implementation of MnDOT's Enterprise Risk Management Program. At the national level, Deanna is co-chair of the AASHTO Committee on Performance-Based Management's new task force on emerging performance areas, and is also a member of TRB's AJE 20, which is the Performance Management Committee. With that, I'll turn it over to Deanna and to Chris. Thanks very much.
Thanks. So this will be a tag team with Chris, as we said, and I'm going to start and then hand it over to him. So here we go. Oops. Okay, and now momentarily
go to the presentation mode, Deanna.
Oh, yeah. Okay. It takes a village for me. Okay, here we go. So some history at MnDOT and Minnesota. The Next Generation Energy Act passed in Minnesota in 2007 with near universal support. And this act requires the state to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% between 2005 and 2050, while supporting clean energy, energy efficiency, and supplementing other renewable energy standards in Minnesota. An interim goal was also set, 15% reduction by 2015 and a 30% reduction by 2025. The Minnesota Department of Commerce and the Pollution Control Agency are required to report the emissions reductions achieved, as well as what is necessary to eventually achieve the full 80% reduction by 2050. Then in 2008, 2 additional goals were added to the statute that created the Minnesota Department of Transportation. So goal number 15, new in 2008, was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the state's transportation sector, and goal 16, to accomplish the goals with minimal impact to the environment. MnDOT has also been reporting fuel use in Minnesota in our annual transportation performance report since we started that report in 2009. That was being used as a tracking indicator, a proxy for greenhouse gas emissions. We also report MnDOT fuel use and BMT. In 2017, we adopted a GHG emissions reduction target in the statewide multimodal transportation plan. To get that target, we applied the Next Generation Energy Act 2025 target to transportation emissions. More detailed reporting is available in the sustainability report on our Sustainability and Public Health webpage. Lays out our efforts at the time anyway to reduce GHGs and other sustainability efforts. And that's somewhat historic now, as Chris will talk about the new stuff we are doing in a few slides from now. Here is another graphic from the 2019 sustainability report and from our performance dashboard. We show a detailed inventory of GHG emissions from transportation and MnDOT's projections as the detailed data lags. In 2016, transportation overtook the electricity generation sector to become the #1 source of GHG emissions in Minnesota. And this is consistent with trends in other states and expected to continue. In 2016, 9 states signed a joint letter supporting the national GHG measure. And despite it being repealed, MnDOT supported or has been reporting results and targets for GHG on the NHS in 2018 and in 2020 as part of the biannual performance reporting. And we point out in our submission that doing those calculations takes a very small time commitment, approximately 2 hours or 2.5 hours of our staff time. And so here's the graphic of plotting our NHS GHG estimates compared to the targets. Again, applying the Next Generation Energy Act to the NHS as a straight line to 2025. So despite our best efforts to reduce transportation emissions, we do not expect to achieve the targets. Pretty clear based on that graphic there. And as Matt mentioned, just this week, 11 state DOTs signed a letter expressing encouragement and support of a GHG performance measure. A more complete comments on the NPRM will be submitted after additional review. And now I will hand it over to Chris to talk about our efforts to address GHG by giving people multimodal options to reduce VMT. So I'll go on mute and let Chris take over.
Deanna, do you want to advance? Thanks. Hi, everybody. So we thought we would share just kind of a significant focus area for us over the last year and a half in addressing greenhouse gas emissions, and what we've been doing through our statewide planning outreach is a effort to identify a VMT reduction target. And what I'm going to focus a lot on is how we've been talking about the role of VMT and the interplay with greenhouse gas emissions. I'm going to share with you a little bit about the outreach that we've done and the modeling scenarios, the role identification process that we've been doing with our local partners, and then also some of the strategies that we can employ with our partners and how we've been bucketing those. We're also going to talk a little bit about how different place types influence VMT and how we've been talking about that, and then kind of wrap things up with a reemphasis on the messaging around VMT. And as folks probably on this call are pretty familiar, the interplay around vehicle miles traveled and how you talk about it is really important, and it's also really important to kind of frame it in terms that resonate with the public. So Deanna, if you want to move to the next one. So we kind of have this stool analogy. I'm sure a lot of folks have probably seen something like this. We talk about kind of a couple of different areas that we have influence over in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There's, as Matt had mentioned, we have electric or zero emission vehicles as a big priority, lower carbon fuels, and then changes to our system operations, like we have an easy pass system, kind of a hot lane system, and transit advantages and so forth. And then, as I mentioned, recently we've been talking more about the role of VMT, how VMT has increased, and what that tells us about the overall health of the multimodal transportation system. So first, though, I'll go to the next slide here and share with you some commentary that we've been doing in our outreach process. As I'm sure a lot of folks across the country would see in their VMT data, our VMT in Minnesota has grown at about 40% over the last 30 or so years, yet our population has only increased 23%. So our VMT is nearly gone up twice as fast as our population. And so we see sort of an emerging disconnect between how much folks are traveling and the overall size of our state. And that suggests a bit of a mismatch that we've been talking about and working through. And there's also kind of some opportunities to talk about the fact that a huge share of trips are just a couple of miles, and that if we improve options for folks, that they can then leverage some of those other options. So that just gives a little bit of context on how we've been framing this like VMT as a topic. And now I'm gonna talk a little bit about some of the outreach that we've been doing. So we had an advisory group that was providing some recommendations to our body. We don't have a commission, but if we did, it would be basically a suggestion to our commission for setting up a VMT reduction target about 1.5 years ago. And what that set in motion was us looking at a couple of different scenarios for reducing VMT, and we integrated these scenarios and modeling options into our statewide planning outreach process. And we're actually still in the middle of that right now. But what came from that internal and external outreach was a draft reduction target for VMT of 20% per capita looking out to 2050. And it's a 7% overall. We, as a part of our conversation with the public, talked a bit about what was in our kind of sphere of influence, and then also we modeled what what's possible across the transportation system in terms of reduction. And as you can imagine, there's a fair amount of uncertainty when setting up a modeling strategy of this type. And so what we tried to do with this graphic that we're showing is really express that level of uncertainty in setting up a projection of where we might be with VMT, and then where we might be able to reduce VMT looking out over the next 30 or so years. But this modeling exercise allowed us to really start to have folks kind of weigh the trade-offs of like what's possible for us, what's practical, and what's ambitious. And we probably landed somewhere in between in the overall recommendation that came out of that outreach process. So I'll now move into a discussion about what, for folks that work a lot with performance measures, it's really important to lay out the measures and what you're going to be doing. But a key strategy that we've been using of late is sort of starting to talk about what areas within a given performance measure or performance area MnDOT can be leading on, where we could be partnering with local government and nonprofits, and then also where we can be just supporting, not necessarily having an active role, but just kind of being at the table. And for us, as we think about developing strategies, we've been trying to bucket our strategies into these different areas so that we can better identify where we have the best opportunities to be a leader, where we might not have as much influence and control, and so where we could be partnering. So if you want to move to the next slide, how we've now taken this concept around roles is we've mapped it to the strategies that we've been talking about to kind of give some actionability to the VMT reduction target. And what we've done is we put it into 4 different buckets that we felt like kind of play a significant influence over our VMT. And that is land use, where and how we're spending on our highway system, our travel options, so the degree to which our multimodal system is serving bikers, pedestrians, and transit, and then also what we're doing in terms of transportation demand management. So road pricing, how are we helping build out our broadband network? We're a state with a lot of rural areas, and so we've been talking about where there is lower access to broadband. And this has been a great way for us to sort of talk about what we can be doing, what our local partners can be doing in more actionable ways. And I'm going to now talk a little bit about I'm sure as you've been thinking about this topic that I'm discussing around VMT, one thing that comes to mind, one thing that jumps out to folks when we're having a conversation about VMT is that, depending on where you live, your VMT patterns are quite different. So if you're living in a rural part of our state, your VMT as a family is around 25,000 miles on average. And in our urban areas, it's a little bit lower. And so we have been trying to express and think directly about the obvious differences in where folks live and how those options change. And so what we've been trying to do is tailor our messaging for these specific areas. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about in that regard was what we've been trying to do around messaging. If you want to move to the next one. We have really tried to make sure that the messaging around VMT is not about us saying or telling anyone that they can't or shouldn't drive, but really framing it around the options that in many places are not there right now for folks to choose other ways to get around. And that by us using a measure like VMT and establishing a goal for reducing VMT, we then can start to talk about where and how our transportation system can better serve people who are living in rural areas, who are living in suburban areas. And so to give you an example, we've talked about a person living in a suburban area, and she currently drives to work every day and doesn't really have any options for getting around other than her own personal vehicle. She would like to use transit to get to work. She has a grocery store that's near her house, but she has to cross a rather large roadway to get there. So she doesn't really use other modes of transportation. And then if we think about the transportation system in 2050, what we could be doing is providing improved transit options for her so that 1 day a week, 2 days a week, she's taking transit. She's maybe able to use a better broadband network to telework. And then also looking to improve the crossings in her community so that she feels safe to go to her local grocery store by either walking or biking rather than using her vehicle. And so this has been sort of a key thing that we've been trying to talk to folks about on how, you think of, 10 trips in a given week or 10 trips in a given period of time, and how those, how providing different options might suit different folks living in areas like a suburban context or a rural context, so that we're not just talking about the kind of the commonly refrained example around urban areas. So this is sort of what we wanted to talk through with you all. If there's any questions, we'd be happy to respond. I'm just looking in the chat here.
I'm not clear if we're doing questions now or.
Yeah, we'll do the questions at the end after all of the presentations, so we have enough time, make sure we have enough time for those presentations. Thank you so much, Deanna and Chris. I really enjoyed your presentation. And our next speaker is Teresa Takuchi, who will cover Colorado's greenhouse gas rule and GHG mitigation measures policy directive. Teresa serves as Colorado Department of Transportation's GHG program specialist. In her role, she has worked to draft and implement the state's GHG transportation planning rule and policy, and help CDOT do its part to meet standard statewide goals for GHG reduction from the transportation sector. Previous to working at CDOT, she has over a decade of experience in developing GHG and air quality policy with the state of Colorado at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment and the Colorado Energy Office. She has extensive experience leading teams focused on reducing GHG emissions from a programmatic, policy, and technical level. Please join me in welcoming Teresa. And Teresa, I will share my screen here.
Thanks so much, Lori. Hi, everyone.
Sure.
Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. As Lori mentioned, I will be talking about Colorado's greenhouse gas rule and our policy directive. So if we go to the next slide. So in Colorado, we've been dealing with a lot of the effects of climate, from fires and floods to mudslides. And so we're really excited to be able to do significant work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Colorado across all of our different sectors. And I'll talk to you about a little bit about the background of how we got to the specific rule. But we're really excited about this rule. On the slide, you can see on December 16th of 2021, our Transportation Commission really approved this. It's a groundbreaking new rule that reduces pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. And it improves air quality, it reduces smog, and ultimately, it provides more travel options for Coloradans. The next slide, please. So I wanted to take a quick minute, and as I mentioned, Colorado is really looking at all of the different sectors of greenhouse gas emissions. So wanted to talk a little bit about the background that led up to this rulemaking. So in 2019, the state legislature passed House Bill 19-1261, which was the Climate Action Plan to Reduce Pollution. And this plan really showed different reduction levels that to achieve significant greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So you can see these outlined here: a 26% reduction by 2025, 50% by 2030, and 90% reduction by 2050. And if just to kind of give some more context to that, this graphic on the right shows all of the different sectors within Colorado. So we're looking at all different types of sectors and and looking at what the emissions are for each of those sectors. So we also had the Colorado Greenhouse Gas Roadmap, which basically that's exactly where this graphic is from on the right-hand side of the screen. And it shows that transportation is the greatest source of emissions in Colorado, greenhouse gas emissions in Colorado. And again, you can, similar story to many of you, that has surpassed the energy sector due to renewable. So now transportation is the largest source. And so the roadmap essentially outlined that this idea of creating this greenhouse gas pollution standard for transportation planning. After that, Senate Bill 21-260 really made this roadmap recommendation for transportation planning a requirement. And that Senate bill, it was actually our transportation funding bill. And so as part of that bill, it said that we needed to look at regionally significant projects. And again, you'll hear me talk more about that in the context of what this rule, what types of projects this rule is looking at. But we're looking at regionally significant projects and reducing emissions from planning. I wanted to take another minute just to, if any of you are familiar with air quality conformity, that's a very similar framework that this rule is. It's adopting a framework so that people can kind of understand the context of what we're trying to achieve if they think about this in the context of air quality conformity. The next slide, please. All right, so this rule focuses on changing how Colorado thinks about transportation planning by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And this rule only applies to the decisions that are made by government agencies and regional planning organizations and it focuses on passenger cars. So we are not looking at trucks or airplanes, which again, in that previous graphic, you can see that those sources do make up transportation, but this is just focused on surface transportation. And when I talk about transportation planning, I know many of you are transportation planners, but essentially long before you see construction work that's happening, like work on the highway, those projects were outlined in a transportation plan. And these transportation plans describe goals for the transportation system, like to improve safety, increase mobility, and improve road conditions. But they also list specific projects that help meet these goals. Now, these projects in turn really impact how people travel. For instance, if a wider highway might make it easier to drive. Safe bike lanes make it easier to take a bike. Or if there's a convenient bus stops, people are more likely to take transit. So transportation plans include a mix of all of these types of projects. And really detailed models allow us to predict what travel choices people will make when there are more or less choices available to them. So these travel choices that each individual makes really impact the greenhouse gas emissions that are resulted from them. So because government agencies like CDOT and the MPOs create these transportation plans, this rule is really focused on them. The next slide, please. All right, so I wanted to take a quick minute for the purposes of this audience to talk a little bit about the outreach on the draft rule. So I wanted, this was important because this was one of the successes of the rule, was we really did a lot of outreach. So on this slide, I talk a little bit about our hearings, but I also want to back up just a moment just to explain that we also did significant outreach even prior to these hearings. So essentially starting in January, these hearings were in September, but in January, we started talking to stakeholders. And we had dozens of meetings with stakeholders. So I'll just take a moment just to say, really, this was a very critical part of our rule is we reached out to our stakeholders. We had dozens of meetings. We didn't hold just one hearing for this rulemaking. We actually held 9 around the state in hybrid modes, so people could attend virtually or in person. They were at local community centers. They were extended into evening hours. And also, instead of having our usual 30-day public comment period, we actually had a 60-day public comment period. So that also just kind of got many more comments, much more comments. The next slide actually outlines the different comments that we've received. And you can see that many people commented on this rule and attended our hearings. So you'll notice the numbers on that slide really outline, sorry, if we go to the next slide, I meant there might be a bit of a delay. Thank you so much. You can see that we received a lot of oral public testimony and written public testimony, but the really important part of this were these comments together really included thousands of different comments. So some of the comments had hundreds of comment letters associated with them. And more than that, they actually suggested specific edits that some were very specific red line edits, even broader statements about the rule itself. So the combination of all of this public input really made this rule really impactful and the best that it could possibly be. So we took the time to make hundreds of edits, both large and small, to provide this clarity and improve the implementation of this rule. So we are happy that we really had a diverse set of voices and suggestions as part of our outreach. The next slide, please. All right, so to take a minute and talk a little bit about the rule, and I know I'm gonna go through these quickly, so feel free to reach out to me personally if you'd like more information. But I wanted to just note that the rule affects the Colorado Department of Transportation itself in our 5 MPO areas. The MPOs are in colors on this graphic, this map, and CDOT is in the gray region, so in the non-MPO areas. CDOT also has a shared responsibility in the MPO areas though. The next slide, please. Okay, and again, just kind of at a very high level, what's required is that CDOT and each MPO, we need to adopt these long-range transportation plans that reduce greenhouse gas emissions to set reduction levels. And I'll talk a little bit more about those. And each plan has to be modeled in order to make this determination. And there is a specific greenhouse gas reduction level for each of 4 years, 2025, 2030, 2040, and 2050, which aligns again with the documents that I had spoken to earlier, the legislation looking forward and making sure that we're reducing emissions into the future. Each agency also has a greenhouse gas reduction level that's specific to them. So if you go to the next slide, you can kind of see a little bit more about those details. And again, happy to get into more detail, more information. If anyone wants more detail, please reach out to me. But essentially, you can see that we have our 5 MPOs and we have CDOT in the non-MPO area. We have 2025, 2030, 2040, and 2050. And these are the greenhouse gas emission reduction levels for each of these agencies in each of these future years. These are in million metric tons of CO2e. And I want to just note, if you look at the bottom, the total line, we have 1.5 million metric tons that to be reduced in 2030. And you'll notice if you keep following across to 2040 and 2050, those emission levels actually go down over time. And that's maybe counterintuitive. However, what we did for the purposes of this rule is we actually wanted this to just look at transportation planning. And so we didn't factor in electric vehicles. That's kind of taken out. It's in a different section of our roadmap. So we have carved off the impacts of electric vehicles in the fleet. So because cars are getting cleaner, transportation planning has less of an effect in 2050 than it does in 2030. So that's reflected in these numbers. And I just wanted to note that was an important piece for us as well, is to take electric vehicles as a separate item. I also want to note for the purposes of this audience that we did use Vision Eval or EarPad, if you're familiar with that, to do some scenarios in order to come up with these reduction levels. We looked at active transportation, so bike ped, we looked at transit and also land use in order to look at different scenarios of how we could set these reduction levels. And again, happy to give more information if people want that. The next slide, please. So I wanted to also take a quick minute and talk about how we are actually modeling these reduction levels. So we are modeling our baseline, which is our existing transportation plan, and then our compliance, which is our updated plan. And essentially what we're doing is we're running those through, for CDOT purposes, it's our CDOT travel model, and MPOs have their own travel models. We obtain, those are very complex models, and actually that is the reason why Colorado was able to do this type of rule, is because we have such a strong travel modeling team here at CDOT. And also in our MPOs, the idea here is that you get a VMT, congestion and speed on each roadway segment in Colorado. You take that output, and essentially I'm oversimplifying, but you put that into our the EPA MOVES model. And the MOVES model is taking into account the fleet mix, the age of vehicles, the fuel type. And again, it's looking at electric vehicles as well. And together, those two models generate the greenhouse gas emissions. So that's kind of how we are taking our baseline, our compliance, we're looking at future years, and then making sure that we're meeting those reduction levels that are outlined in Table 1. The next slide, please. I also wanted to take a minute to talk about our greenhouse gas mitigation. So I've talked a lot about the modeling, and that is a significant portion of trying to determine how are people making different travel choices. But we also noted during the rulemaking that we recognize that not everything can be modeled, and there are significant things that can be done that maybe the model is not yet sensitive to yet, or we don't have an ability to model it yet, but we know it impacts greenhouse gas emissions. So that's where we came up with these greenhouse gas mitigations. And so they're a key concept within the rule. This is where the policy directive PD 1610 comes in. And really, we expect this to evolve over time, but the next slide really shows what these different types of greenhouse gas mitigations are. This concept is really important because these mitigations that are outlined on this next slide really show the different types of efforts that can help people make travel choices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and again, can't yet be modeled. Sorry, Lori, would you go ahead one more, please? Okay, thank you. So again, you'll hear these different categories. You heard those in our previous presentation as well, but bike ped, transit, medium duty and heavy duty electrification, travel demand management, operations, parking management, and land use. So these are different examples. If you are interested, I'm happy to drop in the chat our specific policy directive that has the calculation methodologies for each of these. So again, it's not done in the model, it's done off model, but this is an ability, we can use these mitigations in order to reach our reduction levels in the rule. So these are proving incredibly important in order to meet those emission reduction levels. The next slide, please. All right, so just want to finish up real quick. I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the lessons that we've learned. So as I mentioned already, but again, just worth pointing out again, it's really important to work with our stakeholders early in the process. And I really think that that made us able to achieve this rule that is looking at things from different angles, from different perspectives, and making sure that our stakeholders are pointing out to us like what is important, what are we missing, and what should be addressed. So I think that the reason why this rule is strong is because of all of the stakeholder involvement that we had started very, very early in the process. I also want to note that collaborating with our sister agencies and having strong relationships and support with them has also proved incredibly important. So we worked very collaboratively with the Department of Public Health and Environment, with the Colorado Energy Office, and again, just kind of making sure that we're thinking about this in a collaborative way, and making sure that we're looking at the different emissions from the state and not double counting things. And then having strong internal modeling capabilities has also proved incredibly important for this rule. So again, developing those capabilities over time is important. And if anyone is interested in looking at something like this, I think that developing your modeling capabilities is pretty key to achieving a similar result. And then the last piece is really being willing to adapt to what we learn over time. We've been really lucky that our Transportation Commission has really talked about this openly, that we are doing something new. It's going to take time, and we're going to learn as we go, and we'll be editing things as we go. So the policy directive has already been updated as we get more and better information, and that will continue with all aspects of this. So I think that's my last slide. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Teresa. I'm back. I see that there are some great chats and everything, and questions and discussions and everything via the chat. So if you have questions for Teresa or for Eric or for Colorado, please put them in the chat. We can sort of talk about them asynchronously somewhat. But next up, I want to introduce Ting Ma, who will talk about GHG tracking and reduction efforts in the District of Columbia. Ting Ma currently works as a performance manager with DDOT. She oversees the Performance Management Division, which drafts agency-wide performance plans, coordinates performance reporting, and uses data to improve business processes that support decision-making. Within AASHTO, Ting serves as the co-chair of CPBM's new task force, along with Deanna, on emerging performance areas. With that, I'll turn it over to Ting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Hello, everyone. Let me share my screen. Oops, my calendar. Let's go to the very beginning. Okay. I hope everyone can see my screen, my PowerPoint presentation slides. So yeah, thank you, Matt, for the introduction. I have to put a little bit disclaimer here because I am not an environmental expert. Our environmental program manager, Ostina Casey, she's on vacation. So I'm here to represent DDOT. I hope I've done a great job putting together the slides and preparing for the presentation, but if I misspoke anything or if I use terms not so correctly, so let me know, and I appreciate the opportunity to learn and grow. So the District of Columbia is in a very unique situation compared to other states. So geographically speaking, especially when you compare us with the Minnesota and the Colorado, we are much smaller. And we are probably the only state or state equivalent that are completely located within an MPO. As you can see here, the gray area is the boundary of our MPO, Washington Metropolitan Council of Governments, and then DC is located here. So because we are small, a lot of our environmental challenges are actually being addressed at the regional level. And that's why we work very closely with our partners, including EPA, including the MWCOG. And our MPO and local jurisdictions collaboratively established the regional GHG emission reduction goals, which are 20% reduction from our baseline year, which is 2005. And then by 2030, we should be reaching a 50% emission reduction. And then by 2050, hopefully we can reach well, we are aiming to reach the 80% emission reduction. As illustrated in the right chart, so over the years, as you can see, our greenhouse gas emission has been decreasing nicely. So between 2005 and 2018, our greenhouse gas emission actually has reduced by 13%. This is a significant progress because during this period between 2005 and 2018, actually our regional population has increased by 19%. So therefore, our per capita emission reduced by 27%, which is quite significant. So regarding the sectors, in 2018, you can see this bar here, transportation accounts for about 40%, and then energy consumption of either residential or commercial buildings account for about 52% of the greenhouse gas emissions in this region. So that's our regional effort. Down to the local front, DDOT, DC DOT, and also our DC Department of Energy and Environment, we are the key agencies in the district, leading the transportation or air quality planning, as well as addressing climate change issues. Of course, this has to be a collaboration effort among the entire among the district. And so we have been working very closely with the DPW, Department of Public Works, DC Department of Motor Vehicles, and Office of Planning, mostly on data sharing and planning efforts. So as you can see in this chart, we conducted our first citywide greenhouse gas inventory in 2006. So this inventory established our baseline, and we have been updating our inventory in 2012, 2018, and 2020. We also regularly report our greenhouse gas emission to the Carbon Disclosure Project, along with major cities from around the world. In the chart, this dotted blue line shows our targets. So our target is actually more ambitious than the MPO's target. Our target is that in 2013, we set this goal here through a plan called the Sustainable DC Initiative, that by 2032, we should be reducing 50% of our 2006 baseline level greenhouse gas emission. And then just recently in 2017, we set our new goal here is by 2050, we should be reaching carbon neutral, meaning 100% reduction from our 2006 baseline. And we call this carbon neutral, or in max words, we can call it net zero emission. And this red line here actually shows our actual greenhouse gas emission. As you can see, we have been making pretty significant progress here. Most recent data, 2018, shows that we have been, our greenhouse gas emission has reduced by 27% compared to where we were in 2006. In terms of the sectors, similarly, like energy consumption from buildings, from residential and commercial buildings, accounts for most of the greenhouse gas emission. For us in 2019, that's 71%. And transportation accounts for about 24%. And then waste 6%. So I have to point out that transportation, this share here, 24%, is actually much lower than the share of transportation in greenhouse gas emission in this region, because the regional-wise, we are transportation accounts for I think more than 40%. But in the city, because we are a high density urban environment, transportation only accounts for 20% of all greenhouse gas emission. And also we have a lot of different transportation choices here. We have people can bike, who can walk, take scooters, they can take public transportation like streetcar, bus, rail transit, and also people carpool a lot. So that's why we have this number much smaller than our regional level. And just like other states, planning plays an important role here in terms of how to mitigate the greenhouse gas emission. And listed on this chart here is all our plans in the past decades. 3 plans in most recent years are the most important, which are the Clean Energy DC, which outlines a roadmap to achieve 50% greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2032, Sustainable DC 2.0, which recommits to innovative and inclusive ways to meet sustainability goals by 2032. And most recently, Carbon-Free DC, it charts the district's pathway to be carbon neutral by 2050. Besides planning, we also implement strategies by legislation. For example, in 2018, just following the Clean Energy DC plan, we have passed this Clean Energy DC Omnibus Amendment Act. And as you can see in the table here, a lot of the recommendations coming out of that Clean Energy DC plan has been adopted, has been made into the law through this act. So that's our citywide greenhouse gas reduction efforts. So if we zoom into transportation, similar to what Matt showed us earlier, the GHG calculator. So the city here at DC, we also has been modeling the impacts of the different transportation strategies. So 2 strategies has been identified have the biggest influences in greenhouse gas reduction. One is the mode shift, that if we encourage more people to use public transportation, to walk, to bike, it's likely we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions significantly. The second major strategy is to electrify both the private vehicle and the public vehicles. So all, the remaining transportation emission can be addressed by other strategies. For example, land use enhancement, transit improvements, congestion pricing, road pricing, and parking policies and pricing. So all these strategies have been included in our statewide transportation, statewide long-range transportation plan, MOVE DC. So MOVE DC was recently updated. We call it MOVE DC 2021 update. The plan has been approved by Federal Highway and also our mayor. So therefore, it becomes our strategic plan for the entire city and provide guidance how we allocate resources, both the federal resources and the local resources, and just guide us how to select projects. So MOVE DC has set 7 targets, which are safety, mobility, management, and operations, enjoyable spaces, equity, project delivery, and sustainability. It develops 18 policies and identified 41 strategies, as well as the metrics and tools to implement those strategies. We do have one policy specifically on greenhouse gas emission, which is to reduce greenhouse gas emission from transportation by 60% by 2032. So in the next couple of slides, I will highlight some strategies to reduce greenhouse gas reduction in MOVE DC. So the first strategy is to create a more dedicated bus lane. So here in DC, we see a lot of potential in buses because with each rider, it saves the city one less car on the street that will emit greenhouse gases. But to attract more people to take buses, we have to improve the bus speed and also reliability. So therefore, DDOT has built a dedicated bus lanes to prioritize bus traffic. So in this photo shows one of our car-free lanes for buses and the bikes. It's a quick build project and allow rapid implementation and require minimum design. So this this dedicated bus lane help our buses and also our WMATA buses operate more efficiently and reduce passenger crowding and maintain a safe distance on buses during this pandemic time. And also bicyclists, they are allowed to use this car-free lanes. So it helps to reduce crowding on sidewalk as well. Our goal is to complete a total of 25 lane miles of dedicated bus lane by fiscal year 2025. The second strategy is to build more green infrastructure. Green infrastructure is very broad, as you can see on the slide. It includes bioretention, rain gardens, street trees, landscaped areas, and it connects the living network in the city with the regional natural areas and the waterways. So one benefit of green infrastructure is that they can reduce the surface and the air temperature surrounding buildings, which leads to a reduction in energy use of that building. So because of that, we have DDOT has been installing green infrastructure as part of our construction projects and in retrofit projects. And I think that research is showing that green infrastructure improve annual greenhouse gas mitigation by 40% on average. The third strategy is to electrify vehicles. So this includes electrifying our public vehicles, such as our circulator buses, and also building charging stations to support the use of private electric vehicles. So in terms of the public vehicles, our goal is to convert 50% of all DDOT vehicles to be electric by FY 2023, which is very close, and to electrify all our DC government bus fleet by 2027. And we are also developing a strategy to support private electric vehicle use by building more charging facilities. So currently we have been working with DOEE to determine the demand for electric chargers through a project called the Transportation Electrification Roadmap. And also we have been encouraging developers to provide electric chargers. And also we have guidelines to allow electric chargers in the public right of way through a permit process. So this is what we are working on right now. Because of the bipartisan infrastructure law, now we have even more resources to tackle GHG and environmental issues. So we have been working on the new National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Navy program. This is an opportunity for us to receive up to 16 million over the next 5 years to build electric vehicle charging network. We are working very hard to complete a plan by this August in order for us to receive the funding. To us, this is a very much needed program because it gives us a good incentive for cities like us to really prioritizing charging station construction. And also there is a new carbon reduction program which will provide 6.4 billion in formula funding to all states and local governments to develop carbon reduction strategies. Yeah, we look forward to get additional resources from those two programs. So yes, that's the end of my presentation on how DC and DDOT, what we are doing to reduce the greenhouse gas emission. I'd like to thank my colleague, Austina Casey and Matthew Gaskin for helping me developing the slides and preparing for the presentation. And also a shout out to my summer intern, Spencer Wagner, for helping me yeah, feel free to email me or my colleagues if you have any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ting. That was really useful. I do want to give a shout out for the 15th Street bike lanes, separated bike lanes. I use those every day when I go into the office. Great infrastructure right there for bike riders.
Thank you for the feedback.
Yeah, we are running a little bit behind. So I do want to say, I want to give all as much time as Gary needs for his presentation. So would encourage people, if you have questions for Ting, to please post those in the chat and we can respond to them that way. I just don't know how much time we're going to have for discussion later on. Just anyways, a lot of great information. So I don't want to limit anybody. So rounding out our speakers today is Gary McVoy, as I said, with McVoy Associates. He's going to talk about NCHRP Project 25-56, which is a web-based GHG reduction guidebook for state DOTs. Now a semi-retired sustainability transportation consultant based in the Adirondacks. Gary was used to work for the New York State Department of Transportation as the environmental director, maintenance chair, and chief of operations. Currently active in research. Gary worked for 4 years as Parsons Brinckerhoff's president for sustainability and climate, and is currently helping New York State update its climate action plan. So with that, we're going to turn it over to you, Gary.
Thank you, Matt. Let me see if I can get my screen to work here. I know we're running short, so I will try to skip through this as quickly as possible so that we can get back on schedule and you have time for questions. And for
Well,
some
please take
reason,
your, I mean, I think it's more important to kind of get the information out there and build awareness of the guidebook. So please don't, we can always, I think, answer questions via the chat and everything.
all right.
So.
And for some reason, my
You need me to share my screen?
I
Gary?
guess, oh wait, I've managed to follow this up. Let me try this again.
Okay.
Share screen. Find the presentation.
Make sure you click at the bottom right.
Share. Okay, now we'll go back.
Go.
All right, here we are.
Excellent.
So timing is everything, as we as Chris Porter, our PI at Cambridge Systematics, John Proudfoot, emissions expert at the good company, and my good friend Dr. John Zamers, probably the foremost air quality expert in the country, or at least one of them, started this development of this guide. The last NPRM on greenhouse gas emissions from transportation was being withdrawn. And now, thanks to Lori, thanks to Ann Hartel, I'm sorry, it was Lori that was doing something else. Thanks to Ann Hartel, the answers to most of the questions that I've seen in the chat can be found very quickly at Web Resource 1 for NCHRP Project 2556. It's all in web format and is intended for you to be able to take the pieces that work for you. And we've tried to provide you with the tools, methods, and data sources that you need for all stages of your greenhouse gas mitigation efforts at all levels of sophistication in response to whatever initiatives that your state is going through. So just to give you a little context, I started with NISDOT as an air quality expert as kind of a postdoc thing, worked as their environmental director for many years, took promotions into maintenance, and finally as director of operations so that I could bring an environmental ethic to the agency. And finally, at around 2008, I got leave to, okay, go and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as an agency. So I was able to call forth all the various functional areas within our department and talk to them about all the various steps that we were going to go through in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And they all nodded politely. Some of them were excited to be there, some not so much. And they all went back with a directive to come back next month with a list of things that you can do in your part of the agency to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And what they all did was they all assigned their youngest, brightest staffer to research this, who immediately jumped into the nearest rabbit hole and never came back. So this is the guidebook that I needed at the time to skip the step of the expert staff going down rabbit holes by being able to give them particular lists of things that they could do together with what it's going to cost, how long it's going to take, how much staff work is going to be needed to get this done. And to get this done refers to various levels of engagement, maturity levels in performance lingo. And I know this is a performance management group, so you're probably all familiar with this. So I'll save a little time by not going through this in detail. But at level 1, we were new to the topic. We weren't quite sure what to do. We were struggling to find our way forward, establish some general policies and objectives, focusing on agency emissions because that was the simplest, most straightforward thing to do. At a more mature level, we would have had established policies and goals with quantitative measurements and feedback mechanisms to help us move our way forward. And at level 4, we'd have had a serious business-like, mature multi-agency effort that would have had good metrics and feedback mechanisms. So in the study, we wanted to see as a beginning, where is everyone across the nation with regard to the various aspects of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And we found, not to our surprise, but most of the agencies across the country were at level 1 on just about everything. A few were at level 2 on several of the issues. Some were at level 3, and a few were at level 4 on a few particular aspects. So we developed the guidebook accordingly. There's a background section. There is an institutional alignment and framework section, which basically means how do you manage your effort internally and how do you relate to your external partners for each of the functional areas within your DOT. Because those of us who work in a DOT are very well aware that there are different functional areas. In New York, we were a little more honest. We called them divisions because they were divided from one another and each had distinct responsibilities, tools, and methods. So we've tailored this guidebook to each of the various functional areas and provided links to the tools that you'll need to implement your program. So section by section, in each section for each particular program area, we've got sections on why to address greenhouse gases at this level, what's the level of effort, what synergies can you achieve? How can you do things for air quality, for greenhouse gas reduction that are complementary and synergistic with what you're already trying to do? And then with the usual mechanics of how to do the inventory development, goal and target setting, strategies, implementation, monitoring, and most importantly, a self-assessment tool. This is the self-assessment tool that you can get with a few clicks of a mouse for the central administration functional area within your DOT. And here again, you see the list of what's in the chapter. I've highlighted the resources link so that you can see there's a bibliography, greenhouse gas evaluation tools, an example, and a great deal of information on zero emission vehicle requirements. And again, self-assessments, which if you clicked on that for central administration and scroll down through it, you'd find a list of what I needed when I tried to implement greenhouse gas reductions within DOT with regard to our administrative section. This is something that you can hand to or ask your program area to look at and report back on, well, how many of these are you doing and what help do you need to do more? Now, we focused in this guidebook on the things the DOT can influence. Low carbon fuels, vehicle fuel efficiency, very important, but system efficiency, reducing carbon intense travel, and reducing emissions from your own operations that you can control are highlighted in this work. We've also tried to provide you with some context for each of the strategies. You'll note that the emissions come from the system, obviously, but you can do significant, useful, perhaps exemplary work on your own system. Show the way. And for each of the functional areas, we've broken it down into what you might achieve using various strategies. This one happens to be for construction and maintenance. And you can see the use of renewable diesel is a big contributor, but substituting for Portland cement, substituting for virgin asphalt are both things that can be done, as can things like using renewable electricity and LED lights, of course. And things like warm mix asphalt, while they help symbolically, not so much in terms of actual emission reductions. Again, the tools and the data sources for how to do all these things are included with a link. And now just a few words on implementing strategies within DOT. You're going to have climate change partners. That's been mentioned in several of the other presentations. Some will be very helpful. Your environmental agency can be helpful. The Commerce Department certainly can be very helpful when you're trying to do things like substitute fly ash for Portland cement. Your state budget office is probably critical, and your usual partners in the transportation field. But NGOs and others may be a little bit skeptical as to your intent and your abilities. After all, you are the ones who paved the state. So with these and other groups, if you can take this guide and show them some of the moving parts that are involved in getting these greenhouse gas steps completed, you can gain credibility with them and ideally get some support for what you're doing and perhaps even some assistance. We've recommended that if you're going to get serious about greenhouse gas reductions, that you get a charter set up to explain exactly what you're going to do, what the expectations are, and that you work across your agency to try and achieve greenhouse gas emission reductions on a program area by program area basis, and that you have regular meetings to track progress and move the effort along. A way to do this would be to use the self-assessment worksheets to acquaint each of your functional areas with what they can do and what it will take to do more to achieve greenhouse gas reductions. Now, these self-assessment worksheets are meant to be completed in less than an hour, but it's a good way to determine where you are on a benchmarking basis and where you might want to go based on where your peers have gone to try and develop greenhouse gas reductions. Because where you want to get to is using the plan, do, check, act cycle. This is performance management. You set the policy, establish the targets, and make assignments. You develop procedures, you do the training, you do the implementation, report back, analyze the reports, check in with your partners, explore alternatives, and improve things year by year. Contact some further information. The link is here as far as getting the web resource. There's also a companion document which explains how we developed the guidebook and has additional information. I'm happy to answer any questions personally if you have any questions or want some help with this. And Chris Porter can give you probably a better view as the principal investigator. And finally, Ann Hartel, who's responsible for getting this in a web format and basically shepherding us through the entire process, is standing by ready to assist if you need funding or other assistance to access and make good use of this material in this worthy effort. Thank you so much. I'll stop there, Matt, and you can take it back.
Great. Thank you, Gary. I think there are some sort of slides that Lori will show. We have a few minutes for questions. I know there are some good chats going on. If somebody has one, a burning question that they really want to ask of the panelists, and maybe the panelists could turn their cameras on if you're comfortable doing that. Is there anybody, and you can use the raise hand functionality within Zoom if you have a question. I have one that I will throw out to the panelists. If I don't see any hands pop up here, but so I guess one that sort of comes to mind, and this is more of a softball, and I can't remember if everybody addressed this or not, but what was your, and coming up with the measures, the metrics, everything to sort of analyze GHG emissions within your state, what was one of the biggest challenges that you saw? And then what was one of the biggest sort of opportunities, that came out of, maybe this is more for Deanna, Teresa, and Ting. What was one of those sort of unintended surprises that you saw that said, hey, I didn't realize we'd be able to do X, Y, or Z, with this. I'm not sure if anybody wants to take the first one.
I'll take a stab at it, Matt. Okay. Again, in my experience, we didn't know how to do it, and we struggled, and that held us back. With the guidebook, now you can just click on measurement within design, construction, whatever, and get access to the tools. Yeah, so you don't have to go search. Yeah, and
that's, I think, a great resource. And I will point out that so it's an NCHRP project. So I do want to say that the state DOTs are the ones that sort of approved that and funded it. So it's a tool that was paid for through the SPNR money through the states. And
we also had trials with 4 different DOTs to make sure it worked.
All right. I guess Ting, Teresa, Deanna, any thoughts on the biggest challenge or the biggest opportunity, sort of unintended opportunity or surprise opportunity?
Yeah, I would like to. Oh,
no, go ahead.
Okay. Well, Deanna, go first.
Okay. I would address the challenge. I don't have any unintended opportunities yet, but I was curious. It's been a hard sell, specifically trying to take VMT reduction on the road, and especially in the non-urban areas where, already we saw that they're traveling more miles. And so we've spent a lot of time with messaging and trying to, explain that we're not telling people they can't drive. And so I'm still in the overcoming challenges phase. And so I'm hoping there'll be some beautiful opportunities coming up.
Teresa or Ting?
Yeah, as DDOT put in the letter, we are very supportive of the performance measures. And a big surprise to me today, actually, Matt, when you talk about by 2025, we should be getting to the net zero emission status. That's exactly our target already set for the city. So it's surprisingly, we are the targets, they are consistent. They're actually the same targets. So I do think it's a great timing that Federal Highway now proposed the new performance measures. It will help us to achieve the targets we have already set for the district.
And I'll just add, thanks, Matt, for the question, that I think that one of the challenges is how we calculated emissions was using 2 different models, using our statewide travel model, using the MOVES model, and doing that on a state level had never been done at our state. So that was just, again, challenging, trying to figure out how do we do this, working together, again, collaboratively. We have 2 different agencies that had run those, and building our capacity within CDOT to be able to do that MOVES modeling internally, but also just such an opportunity as we realize what aspects of the model are really impacting greenhouse gas emissions. So understanding the importance of electric vehicles, but also understanding the importance of land use factors, and really just starting, the more you work with it, the more you get to understand what impacts the greenhouse gas emissions, and Again, that's the stage we're in now, is our compliance and really understanding what can really impact greenhouse gas emissions.
Great, thanks, Teresa. Well, I have 3:30, so that was the one question. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to sort of wrap up now, but I guess to follow on, to echo what Teresa said, I mean, from my perspective, the idea of getting to net zero by 2050 is not just a state DOT. It's everybody. You know, it's everything. It's the demand side, the capacity side. We all have to be in this together and to achieve that. So I think it's much more inclusive than sort of exclusive moving forward. But with that, so thank you very much to our presenters. So Deanna, I think Chris left, but Teresa, Ting, Eric, Sabina, Gary, again, thanks very much for participating today. I know we're all busy, and I think we all really appreciate that. So don't forget, if you're interested in the presentations and a recording, you weren't able to see everything, you can go to the TPM portal, tpm-portal.com, and all the information is there. You can also register for our next TPM webinar, which is going to be on September 21st. Beyond that, we would love to hear from you about any other ideas. Again, this is the broader TPM community. So we have these about it, not about, but every other month. We have the performance management webinars, and the other months we have asset management webinars. And again, all that information. Again, thanks to our presenters today. And also thanks to Christos Xenophontos, who's the lead of the TPM Pooled Fund. And that Pooled Fund program really makes all of this possible. So thanks to everybody who participates and funds that. Please help us to continue the webinar series if you're from a state DOT by signing up for the AASHTO Transportation Performance Management Technical Service Program. The more states, the merrier. We all benefit from it. With that, thanks again. Stay safe, stay cool, all that good stuff. Have a great rest of the summer, and we will see you in September, if not sooner. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
I know.